Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm John Alfred. I'm a resident here at the Hermitage. Most of you know me. Now, I'm going to talk about the year 2020, which is a big anniversary, 75th anniversary of a lot of things that happened during the World War II, things that led up to it. So I'm going to talk about the anniversaries that are coming up. On Sunday, we have anniversary of VE Day, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. VE means victory in Europe. And on Wednesday, September the 2nd, we will celebrate VJ Day, which is the victory over Japan in 1945. These were all 1945, 75 years ago. So there's a lot of things that happened in 1945 and a lot of things that happened leading up to the war and during the war. Some of the things that you may know, may have heard about, probably some of you have heard of these things. If you're old enough, you remember Pearl Harbor, but there's a lot going on before that. For example, before Pearl Harbor, the United States was escorting convoys from the Atlantic seaboard ports to Great Britain. And our agreement with the Brits were that we would escort the convoys as far as Iceland. And then after Iceland, the Brits would take over escorting. And on October the 31st, 1941, which was a month and a half before Pearl Harbor, the destroyer USS Reuben James was sunk by a German U-boat with torpedoes. That was our first touch with the war. And just before Pearl Harbor, on December the 7th, one of our ships, the USS Aaron Ward, sunk a two-man Japanese submarine off the entrance to Pearl Harbor. The story is that that two-man midget submarine had been launched from a regular submarine way out at sea, and it was following one of our cargo ships into the harbor at Pearl Harbor. There's another Navy ship out there, a coastal minesweeper, that saw the periscope and reported it, and the Reuben James started attacking. They fired the guns to, they destroyed the conning tower and dropped some depth charges and finally sunk the two-man submarine. That was about 6:30 in the morning, which was an hour and a half before the bombing started. Now, there's some interesting aspects of Pearl Harbor, which has made the news a long time ago. We had two aircraft carriers out in the Pacific that had been normally in Pearl Harbor. The USS Lexington had taken a bunch of aircraft to reinforce the Marines on Wake Island, or Midway Island, and she was still out there in the Pacific. The Enterprise had just finished unloading some aircraft on Wake Island. I'm getting them mixed up, but the Enterprise was at Wake Island, and they had turned around and they were on their way back in. They were scheduled to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December the 6th, but there was a bad storm, and Admiral Halsey decided to delay the entrance, so they did not get into Pearl Harbor on December the 6th. Just a couple of interesting notes to talk about the aircraft carriers. Now, we started the war December the 7th. We had 6 fleet aircraft carriers, with the Lexington, Enterprise, Saratoga, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp. Did I get them all? Anyhow, there were 6 of them. I told you about the Enterprise and the other one that was, they were out in the Pacific, but the Yorktown was in Norfolk. The Wasp was in Bermuda. The Hornet had just finished their shakedown cruise, and they were getting ready to deploy to the Pacific. those three were in the Atlantic. The other three, Saratoga had just finished a yard period in Bremerton, Washington, and was on their way to San Diego to pick up their air group. So there had been normally 3 carriers in the Pacific, 3 in the Atlantic. So the war started, and in the year of 1942, we lost 4 of those 6 carriers. But before that, I think it was early May of 1942, that Jimmy Doolittle launched his 16 B-25s off of the carrier Hornet to bomb port cities in Japan, Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, I forgot the other names, but they bombed several cities besides Tokyo. The Lexington was lost in the Battle of Coral Sea, which was May of 1942, shortly after Doolittle's raid. And then in June of 1942 was the Battle of Midway. There have been lots of historical movies and articles written about the Battle of Midway. Midway, the 2 carriers that started out at Midway were the Enterprise and I forgot the other one, but the Yorktown showed up afterwards, was late coming. The Yorktown had been pretty well damaged in the Battle of Coral Sea, where the Lexington was lost. And the Yorktown was at Midway. Midway started June the 4th, 1942, and I think the Yorktown showed up on the 5th. But the SPD bombers from the 3 carriers were responsible for sinking the 4 Japanese carriers that were there. A lot of people attribute that battle, the victory at Midway, as the turning point of the war when we finally started our offensive. It didn't last much longer than that, but the Hornet was lost shortly thereafter, and then the Wasp was lost. So we lost the Lexington, Wasp, and the Hornet in 1942. In 1943, the big aircraft carriers, the Lexington class, the Essex class, finally showed up in the Pacific, probably in May of 1943. And they started the offensive with the island hopping. They started with the Battle of Guadalcanal. There's been a lot of history written about Guadalcanal. The Marines were on the canal for 6 months before the Japanese finally departed in February of 1943. They didn't surrender, they just left the island. So, anyhow, after the Essex class carriers started arriving, they started the really offensive, like they called it, leapfrogging, island hopping, jump from island to island. There are several battles that were noteworthy. Tarawa was one of them. They called some of these very rough ones tough times for the Marines and the Army that were invading the islands. In 1944, late 44, I forgot which ones it was, but Iwo Jima was in like February of 1945, and in March, April 1945 was the Okinawa. But let me back up a little bit. We have to talk a little bit about the Atlantic. Everybody remembers D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. So that'll be an anniversary. It'll be coming up soon in June. It'll be the 76th anniversary of D-Day. But they had remember they had the meetings with the big 3, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in Tehran, Potsdam, and then later on, after Roosevelt died, Truman was with them at Yalta. Talking about Roosevelt, Roosevelt died April the 12th, 1945, about 16 days before the Germans surrendered, which is ironic, but he fought. We was there all during the war, all the action and everything, and he died before the Germans surrendered. And ironically, President Truman did not know anything about the atomic bombs that had been tested and were in the works. And as a vice president, he did not know. The Russians knew, but he didn't know. So let me think a little bit and get you back on track. Give me a minute, Mary. Shut me off for a minute.